I hereby negate the resolution. Resolved that all states have an obligation to anticipate, prevent, and minimize the causes of climate change and mitigate its adverse effects. For a topic such as this, it's vital that we look at two areas of analysis. Firstly, the moral obligation that states have, and secondly, the historic context of climate change. The United States Council of Foreign Relations considers climate change to be one of the most significant threats facing the planet today. Multiple calls for action on climate change have appeared on the international and national stages. Climate change is considered to be so great a threat as to literally be able to erase nations from the map. This is especially true in the case of small island nations. While some may take this to mean that an obligation to combat climate change exists, it's in fact simply an extension of a state's own obligation to provide for its survival. As Beth Simmons talks about, all state action is taken via a lens of self-interest. States, much like people, do things which benefit themselves, and in the case of the state, the citizens. This is due to the fact that states' obligation or job is to provide and support the citizenry. To expect it to take actions which would negatively impact itself would be counterintuitive. An obligation to combat climate change would imply that action would be taken even in the face of negative consequences. This is just not the case, however. For example, when Japan had to shut down and move away from nuclear energy, they began to utilize coal-fueled power generation, which is harmful to the environment. They even severed their obligation to reduce emissions. They did this due to the fact that the economy would be negatively impacted if they did not. Any imagined obligation to combat climate change didn't even get considered when weighed against a state's economic self-interest. The acceptance of this is important because it allows us to reevaluate and re-engage with international negotiations in a more productive manner. The Lima Treaty draft is proof of this, since it offers aid to island nations and the implementation of green technology for developing nations, which could help boost their economy, and it's generally heralded as a success. While some would claim that an obligation towards self-interest would not lead to addressing climate change, Jeffrey Ball would disagree. He reports that developing countries are already making moves to combat climate change in the name of things such as economic and health reasons. Additionally, economic self-interest has historically helped to cut down on carbon emissions. In fact, emissions-cutting technology was originally created to cut down on waste and increase profit margins. Now that we've looked at this idea of state obligations, we need to look at the historic context of climate change. In 1992, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, which extended the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to all signatory parties. There are two important parts to this. Firstly is that the Kyoto Protocol and the Lima Treaty draft on climate change only apply to those signatory nations. For example, the United States did not sign the Kyoto Protocol and has pledged that they would not ratify the Lima Treaty along with nations such as India. Simmons writes about how states can't have obligations when they sign or ratify a treaty. The Kyoto Protocol's signatory nations have an obligation to fulfill the Kyoto Protocol. However, this obligation only extends to nations who have signed it. If a nation does not accept a treaty, then they have no subsequent obligation to follow through with it. In this manner, nations which have not signed or agreed to any climate change initiative have no obligation to take action. Secondly, is that developing nations were given a special exemption from climate reduction because it was seen as being negatively detrimental to the longevity and health of the country. Not only does this show a general point of consensus and an exemption from an obligation towards combating climate change, but it also shows an example of the obligation of self-interest being considered. For these reasons, I believe that we can reject that all states have an obligation to anticipate, prevent, and minimize the causes of climate change and mitigate its adverse effects. Thank you.